Welcome to It's All Mental, a podcast from Everyturn Mental Health. Mental isn't a bad word. There's no health without mental health. We're here to talk about every high and low. No limits, just good conversation. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of It's All Mental. I'm Kate Parkins, Head of Marketing and Comms here at Everyturn Mental Health, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Rob Hopkins, today's guest for this week's episode. So to introduce you to Rob, among many other things, he is the co-founder of the Transition Network, which is a movement of communities coming together to reimagine and rebuild our world. He's the author of several books, the most recent of which is From What Is to What If, Unleashing the Power of Imagination to Create the Future We Want. Rob has spoken at TED Global and a number of TEDx events, and he hosts a podcast called From What If to What Next. So welcome, Rob.
Hey, Kate, lovely to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you for joining us. And as I've already told Rob, I am a huge fan of his podcast. It is an incredibly uplifting listen because it's all about harnessing our individual and collective imagination to transform our world into somewhere more fair, equal and beautiful. So for each episode, Rob invites subscribers to send their what if questions, like what if education took place in nature, or what if our economy prioritised health? And then he finds the best guests to help him explore how we can make those ideas a reality. So in the spirit of that idea, today's It's All Mental episode is called What If Imagination Could Improve Our Mental Health? So at the beginning of each of Rob's podcast episodes, he asks his guests to travel with him in an imaginary time machine, which takes them to the year 2030, to a future of our world in which the what if question has come true. So Rob, if I might be so bold as to invite you to buckle up into our It's All Mental time machine, and if we could travel together to 2030 and step out into this future and walk around in a world in which using imagination is the way we inspire and create change, and we've discovered it helps to improve our mental health. Could you tell us, what does this world look like, feel like, sound like, smell like, and taste like?
Good question. I think for me, it is a world that has spent the previous years focused on building what people now call an imagination infrastructure. So it has recognized that the polycrises of climate change, social justice, the toxic legacy and fallout from colonialism that still is with us, all of the different the huge kind of collapse of biodiversity that people were living through in 2024, that a meaningful response to that required us being really open. It required us to recognize that in order to save everything, we had to change everything. And so the building of that imagination infrastructure and the thought that went into that and the prioritizing of the imagination came about because we recognized that our collective imagination muscle had become very weakened and undervalued, and actually what we had done in 2024 was we had created an economy and a society and an education system and everything really in a way that was like a perfect storm of things that were deeply ruinous to our imagination. And when I talk about imagination, my favorite definition of it is by I can't remember what he's called now. John Dewey, the educationalist, that's right. And he said, imagination is the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. And so we recognized that was a superpower that we needed more than any other superpower in 2024 if we were going to find a way through this. So our education system profoundly changed during that time. We realized we were still training people for a century and for an economy that was past and that really had no place. We had a huge scale of stress and mental health challenges among young people, and that so by changing the education system, we were able to find a different way of doing that. So the education system is now much more rooted in play, in creativity, in problem solving, in all of those different things. Schools are now profoundly changed as well. So rather than being like a sort of a kind of, I mean, let's say a prison is a bit too strong, but you know, it's like rather than just being a place you go to have information poured into you, they become places which are, and every day you go to school is like stepping into that future. So schools are much more democratic. They're surrounded by food gardens. Food is being prepared in school. Kids are involved in that. I think our everyday lives are much more democratic. A lot of the things around us are in community ownership, which means that we feel we have much more participation, much more involvement. Our economy is much more equal because we recognize that inequality was one of the key drivers of the depletion of the imagination. And you know, I do this exercise a lot of sort of helping people to 2030, and for me, the thing that I always point out to people is how different. There's a look in people's eyes in 2030 that we didn't have in 2024. That there's a sense of, do you know what? I think we might just do this. There's a kind of excitement and a sense of buy-in and a sense of ownership, and people can see the world around them changing and mental health improving. And because the other thing that we did was that we recognized that mental health is not something that we just put down at the end of the corridor in a mental health box.
Yeah.
So mental health is not like, it's like integrally connected to everything else. It's connected to food, it's connected to housing, it's connected to transport, it's connected to education, it's connected to planting trees. I remember reading a beautiful report by the Real Bread campaign which said baking is the new Prozac. And I feel like alongside that we can say urban gardening is the new Prozac, growing your own mushrooms is the new Prozac, and living in a house that is well insulated and that you can afford the rent on is the new Prozac. You know, it's like, so what happened was we realized that the silos that said that's a mental health issue, we broke all those silos down, and that actually people being able to cycle in safe places with their kids, people having access to subsidized electric bicycles is a mental health strategy, etc., etc. So that was one of the big changes that we see, was that we've moved from just breaking things down to connecting things up.
I can feel myself easing into this world of 2030, and for those who are listening to this rather than watching it, I've just been beaming throughout.
She has, I can confirm that.
Of 2030, and I 100% agree around mental health. It's not, you know, it's at our peril that we address what we consider to be mental health issues in isolation to anything else, because
Yes.
Good mental health is about where we live, how we live, having people to connect with, having a sense of purpose, all of those things you described. So yeah, I love to hear that, and I really hope that is what our 2030 is going to look like. And I mean, as you said, this is an exercise you do often, both on your own podcast and also when you do training or lead workshops. So can you tell us why you chose to begin each of your podcast episodes with a time travel walk like this? And I'm sure you do similar in your workshops. Why begin with this?
So it's something that I started doing in my talks, and I've done that exercise now with thousands and thousands of people. I did it in a hall in Belgium with 1,500 people, all sitting, time traveling. You could have heard a pin drop. It was just a magical thing. And as I do it more and more, it becomes more and more kind of theatrical almost. It's like, you know, like I have a time machine. I was just looking in my bag earlier on to see if I could find it, but I have my little time machine. So I always say to people, you know, here in Totnes, I live in Totnes in Devon, and people know many things about Totnes. What you might not know is that we have the world's first successful time machine program here, and in a secret laboratory deep underneath Totnes Castle. We've spent years working on it, and we finally cracked it. But the problem is that the actual time machine itself, after Brexit, is very hard to get an export license for a time machine. It takes ages. So we had to create this sort of portable version. which can turn any room into a time machine. And it's basically a little wooden box that has this very bright pink light in it. It fills the room up with light. And and then I always get however I do it, if I do it in workshops or in talks, you need something that marks you moving from one place to another. So in a big group of people, I get everybody to hum. That's the sound of the time machine. And then it sort of fades away and everyone just sort of sits in the quiet. And I always make very clear to people that we're traveling to the 2030 we're traveling to is not a utopia, and it's not a dystopia. It's a 2030 that resulted from us doing everything we could possibly have done between now and then. And the reason that I focus on 2030 and not 2050 or 2462 or something is that what fascinates me is that the Paris Agreement, which already is not ambitious enough in terms of actually addressing climate change, says that by 2030 we need to have cut our emissions in half. So what interests me is, what would that be like? What would that be like if we were firmly on track and people could see that direction shifting and people were really excited about it? And how do we bring that alive for people? So you could kind of see it's not the finished object, but it's kind of getting there. And so I do that in workshops, like I say, I do it in talks, I do it on the podcast, I do it in all sorts of different spaces, and I've done it with lots of people. And what's really interesting to me is that actually the responses that you get from people are really consistent. No one ever says, "Oh, we've got a new IKEA that's 4 times bigger than the one we had in 2024." Everybody always says, "Oh, the air smells so nice and the bird song is so loud and people seem much more relaxed." And I'm just at the moment I'm starting. But then I've shifted the way that I do my own presentations and talks now. So rather than saying just what needs to happen is this, and I'd say to people, in Totnes, we have a time machine. We regularly travel there in order to take photographs and to talk to people and to make audio recordings of what it sounds like, and then we bring them back. So when I do my talks, I say, you might like to think of me as being like the Marco Polo of climate change. And I've been there. I saw this beautiful placard this young woman had at one of the Black Lives Matter protests in Washington in 2020, which said, "I've been to the future, we won." And it gave me goosebumps, and it made me think, okay, what does climate activism look like if it has that at its heart? And so I'm just researching a book now, which I've got to get written by July, which is about time travel as a tool for activists. And I had a real aha moment reading. I'm reading a lot of papers and books and stuff about it, and actually, when you imagine the future, it's a very, very, very similar process to when you imagine the past. Like your memory and your imagination are very, very similar. And when you are imagining the future, you're basically going to the cupboards of your memory and looking through them and then finding bits and putting them together. And then that's the imagination bit. If someone says, "Oh, and if you've never been to Italy," and someone says, "Oh, I'm going to take you on a holiday to Italy," you're trying to imagine Italy. You're looking through your cupboards going, "Italy, Italy, Italy. Oh yeah, pasta, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, Vespers," and then you're going to piece that together, and you're going to make an idea of what you would be like, kind of in that setting. And but the thing that I came across recently was saying, actually, if you make a vision of the future and you do it with enough intensity and it's enough of an experience, then what happens? Oh yeah, sorry, I go back slightly. So when you're trying to imagine the future, you can only be as imaginative as you have relevant, useful stuff in your memory cupboards. So it's very hard to imagine a low carbon future if you watch Fox News all day, because you've got no material to work with at all. And so I always say, when people say, "Well, how can I become more imaginative about the future?" I say, you need to find those stories, fill your memory up with those stories. But what happens when you imagine the future, a positive future, in a way where you attach emotions to it, where you're excited about it, where maybe you're thrilled by certain bits and you feel connected to other people around you who are sharing that experience, then what happens is that vision that you've made of the future gets put into it becomes a memory. So it's like there's a really interesting fluidity there where your vision of the future becomes a memory and kind of goes into your past, so you can then go through it, which is really interesting. Which is why, actually, if I just in my talk said, talk to the person next to you about how you'd like the future to be, that's a very different thing to saying, I've got a time machine. We're going to, oh, so exciting. And when I say I've bought my time machine, I get everyone to go, ooh. And then I play people recordings that I made in 2030. This is, you actually, how many talks do you go to where you get played an actual recording from the future? Ooh. And, you know, so actually it becomes, yeah, like, so it has to become something that people like attach excitement and anticipation and audacity and stuff to, and then it gets put into the into their memory, and then that gets really interesting, I think.
Is I love the way you describe that, and it sounds very multi-sensory as well, because you're not just thinking, oh, factually, what should we do to, you know, tackle the climate crisis? It's what would it smell like if we did, and what would it sound like? What would you hear in the sounds? It sounds like you really take people there in your talks, and I know you're doing the podcast because I've listened to it. So, oh, it's really, yeah, it feels like the multi-sensory experience is important, and I love the idea of the future as memory. That's amazing, quite mind-bending.
Yeah, well, so one of the projects that I'm doing at the moment is working with this amazing young ambient, I listen to a lot of kind of ambient electronic music. I really like it, because that bit where electronic music meets classical music, sort of, very, because it doesn't have any beats and it doesn't have any lyrics. I can concentrate while I listen to it, so I can work and listen to it. It's a whole beautiful genre of music I'd just discovered at the beginning of COVID, really. And there was one guy, and so there are people in that who use field recordings. They go out and they record different things and they weave it into what they've done. There's one guy whose work that I loved, who's called Mr. Kit, and he does this. He does that. He used field recordings in a really. There's one particular track of his I just listened to over and over and again, because it really captured a sense of community and connection and excitement and magic. And I thought, what would it be like if we did that, but the recordings were from the future? Like, you went to the things that already sound like, there are places in the world you can go to that already sound like that future would sound like. You go to the bicycle Utrecht, the bicycle rush hour in the middle of Utrecht. It sounds like the future where everyone's riding bicycles. You go to the Vauban in Freiburg, the biggest car-free neighborhood in Europe. You can record what living in a city with no cars would actually sound like. And so I thought, well, if I did that project, I'd love to do it with that Mr. Kit guy, but I bet he's like impossibly cool and lives in Berlin or LA or something like that. And actually, it turns out he lives in Totnes. He lives in my town. I had a cup of coffee with him, and it was, and we've done like 6 or 7 tracks, and it's a really lovely project. So, my brief to him was that it should cultivate a nostalgia for the future, and so that kind of picks up on that.
It does. So I love this idea, this mind-bending idea of the future as the present and as a memory as well. You're saying the future's kind of already here. If you go to certain places in the world, they've achieved some of the things that we would hope to achieve. This is an amazing idea to be able to recall the future, but also live in it too. So I'm really interested. Obviously, you're someone who cares deeply about many different topics, and you've mentioned a few of them at the beginning there. You talked about the climate crisis and decolonialization and other things, education. So I'm wondering, how did you become so interested in the power of imagination specifically? It's not something you read about so often in these contexts. So what was it? What was the prompt for you to think, oh, actually, imagination has got such a huge role to play?
Mariam Kaba, who's an awesome prison abolition activist in the US, who I spent 70 something episodes trying to get on my podcast, and finally got her on. Total fanboy moment. She said, we must imagine while we build, always both. And I look, and it gave me a lens of looking back at what we had done up to that point in the transition movement, that actually it's about visioning and imagining and then going and doing it. But this something just started to kind of gnaw away at me. This sort of idea that at the time in history where this sort of terrifying confluence of challenges demands that we reimagine everything, the possibility that actually it might be that at that very moment we've also created the perfect conditions for our collective imagination to kind of wither and disappear. So it felt like just over here, where you can't see, is something really important, our imagination, which is just sort of withering away. And what I wanted to do with the book was put it back in the middle of the table and go, this is really, really important. I feel like, you know, it's this perfect storm of kind of these bloody sort of addictive things we carry around in front of us that are just distracting us all the time, and that are more addictive than we're evolutionarily able to do anything about. An education system that has almost entirely designed the arts and creativity out of itself completely. And the more unequal a society becomes, we know that our imagination suffers, etc., etc. You know, the rise of sort of precariousness. How are you supposed to be imaginative if you're living with sort of police brutality, if you're living with a housing situation? All those things that are driving the mental health crisis are also driving the unraveling of our collective imagination. It's really dangerous. So that was what made me think, this is really important.
And you mentioned earlier as well around, you know, the many challenges we face. And I know in your book you talk about kind of the epidemic of loneliness and of anxiety and general mental ill health. So I'm wondering, like, in the work that you've done on the power of imagination, in what ways have you noticed it impact people's mental health in a positive way, getting involved in imagination and activism?
I remember I went to visit one transition group. I can't remember where it was, but the guy who picked me up at the station when we were walking back to the place where the talk was, he said, you know, even if this transition group fell apart and stopped tomorrow, I know 200 people I didn't know before I got involved, and that's really important to me. And there was a study, I think in 1997 in Chicago. They had a huge heat wave in Chicago, and lots of people died. I can't remember the numbers; they're in the book. By very good book by Eric Klinenberg called Palaces for the People, if people want to follow up on the story. But there was this heat wave and lots of people died, and they did this study about, well, why did the people who died, what was it about their situation? So that their starting thing was, well, it was going to be impoverished communities. People died because they didn't have air conditioning and stuff. Actually, what they found out was that the deaths were pretty equally distributed across relatively wealthy neighborhoods as well as poor neighborhoods. And they found that actually the thing that made the difference was that in some rich communities, people never see each other. And in other wealthier communities, are actually the architecture is designed so you're bumping into each other all the time, and you're at the farmers market, and in some working class communities, people never see each other, and you have this, like, the art is designed so you never see each other, and in others, people are in each other's houses all the time and very sociable. And it was the thing that made the difference, was that lack of kind of social cohesion and kind of community glue, you know. And so in transition, it's very much about finding those ways to bring people together. I always think it's a bit like if you want to build a new coral reef, you don't sort of breed coral and somehow train it to go off and find and hang out. What you do is you chuck stuff into the ocean, usually like old cars or concrete blocks or something, that you put in a particular place, and then the coral comes. So it's like, actually, if you build the opportunities for people to come together around things, then they come. And so that's a lot of what we try and do in transition, is to create those moments, those kind of flashpoints, those opportunities for people to come together and to connect with each other. One of the things that we did in Totnes, because the beautiful thing about transition, right, is, like, started here in Totnes. Now there's like 300-400 transition groups across the UK, but there's also transition groups in 50 countries around the world, in this kind of self-organized network of people. So when somewhere has a good idea, that idea can spread and replicate very, very quickly. So in 2013, we came up with this project in Totnes that was called Transition Streets. The idea was, how do we support people to reduce their energy use, their water use, stuff like that? How do you do that? What do you send? I don't know. What do you do? So we thought, okay, we'll design a process where people meet in each other's houses 7 times, and they look at water one week, energy the next week, food the next week. We produced a kind of a workbook for them. We facilitated the first meeting for them. We did it. 550 households took part in a town of 9,000 people, and And so by the end of it, the research showed that each household on average had saved about 1.3 tons of carbon. So they saved about £600 a year. But the much more interesting than that was that when they were all surveyed, very detailed, done by the university, very detailed kind of follow-up, was that when they were asked, nobody mentioned the money, nobody mentioned the CO2. Everybody said, I know my neighbours, I feel more connected, I feel part of this place. Lots of those groups carried on meeting afterwards. When they'd finished the 7 sessions, they just carried on meeting because they were having such a hoot. And lots of them then started other projects. There was a community cinema came out of it, community orchard came out of it, all sorts of stuff. It meant that then when COVID started, and streets were thinking, oh, we really should create a sort of mutual support sort of, oh, they already had it. They already had the WhatsApp groups in place. They already had the things in place because they'd already been doing it. And so for me, it's like a lot of what happens in transition is really just about creating the infrastructure for people to come together around and to have conversations around. And for years in Totnes, we had a local currency called the Totnes pound, which was just beautiful. And we had a 1, a 5, a 10, and a £21 note, just because we loved when people would say, "Why have you got a £21 note?" We could say, "Why not?" And it was a really lovely thing. And there was a study that was done, I think in what was it? Maybe it was in Brixton, but showed that actually when people go shopping with local currency, they have loads more conversations than when they go shopping with a plastic card. Because when you go shopping with a plastic card, you go into a shop nowadays, it's self-checkout. You don't even need, you could do all of your shopping. You don't need to have a single conversation with anyone. When you go shopping with local currency, everyone's like, "Oh, I love it when people buy with this. Oh, look," and you have all these conversations, like 20, 30 conversations. Otherwise, you would never have had those conversations. So we need to think about a local currency as being a mental health strategy.
So given all of this very strong case for imagination and its, its ability to change things, to bring people together, to improve mental health, what advice or ideas could you give to someone who isn't familiar with this as an idea, using their imagination? How might someone be able to start exploring using their imagination in this kind of transformative way?
Yeah, I think one of the things is a recognition that the imagination needs space. Like any organization that is serious about wanting to reimagine what it does has to give that process space. My friend Phoebe Tickell, who is an amazing imagination activist, who has designed imagination activist training that she runs with Camden Council in London, the first local authority to do imagination activist training. Awesome, really important work. That requires that organization to say, okay, we need to dedicate some create space and staff time to building that imaginative muscle within this organization. And they have a CEO who is fascinated by that and who is really up for that journey. So the imagination needs space. As I mentioned before, these toxic things we carry around in our pockets that are just guzzling our attention all the time. We have to develop a new relationship with those. I always like to tell the story, and I tell it in the book as well, about I invite people to imagine that they're in the Yellow House in Arles, in France, in Place Lamartine in 1888. And Vincent van Gogh comes in with this beautiful bunch of sunflowers, and he's just bought them in the market, and he arranges them on this table in a little earthenware pot, and he sits back to look at them as the sun comes in the window, and he goes, "Oh, yes, oh, I must just check my Instagram, oh, my Facebook and my TikTok." And 2 hours later, he's watching skateboarding videos on YouTube, and he can't even remember why he started to watch skateboarding videos on YouTube. Then he wouldn't have painted any of those paintings, any of those sunflowers paintings that have brought so much delight and joy to millions of people over hundreds, over the decades. So it's like, how many of the great things that we need now in time, the great ideas that could tackle climate change in our communities, in our lives, don't happen because we think, oh, I must just check, So and I think as well, all of us have in this world we live in, we have all set up our kind of social media feeds. We can sort of bespoke information that comes to us. But what we don't often think about, it means we tend to design something that is just giving us this relentless barrage of heartbreaking, ghastly, grim news from all around the world. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be informed about what's happening in the world, but I do think we have a responsibility to our imaginations to ensure that we have some other stuff coming in there, like the transition movement, like We Are Possible, like, there are lots of people. Positive News, subscribe to Positive News. It's awesome. Follow them on social media.
Also a big fan of
There's,
positive news.
yeah, it's like, actually we need to be having those stories, to go back to what I was saying at the beginning. We need to be filling up the memory cupboards, our
Yes.
memory cupboards, with positive stories,
Yeah.
because otherwise what happens is, actually, the more negative news you get, the more you seek out negative news, and so finding those stories. I guess there's things like, meditation. If you read The Body Keeps the Score,
Mm.
which is one of the most awesome books people's a good Van der Kolk's book. Awesome. In there he talks about how anxiety and depression are really damaging to the imagination, and things that are like embodied practices, moving, dancing, yoga, things like that, are really, really good. For me, having some kind of creative practice, some sort of art practice, for me it's drawing and printmaking. For other people it's all kinds of different things, just getting outside, observing, connecting with the world around you, walking, spending time out of doors, that sort of stuff. I find when I'm writing, if I get stuck, go for a walk, ride my bicycle, and then I have to keep stopping and writing things down. It's like you have to give your imagination space in order to function. Fiction, poetry. Yeah.
That is a beautiful shopping list of well-being ideas, and I'm really interested because everything you've mentioned there is all stuff that's brilliant for our mental health anyway.
Yeah.
Imagination and good mental health feels like they go really hand in hand. Giving ourselves space to do what makes us feel settled and centered and like ourselves and not rushed and hurried will also give space to imagination. Rob, thank you so much for joining us today. In a one sentence answer, because we always like to end the podcast on this note. Among all the challenges we're facing, what is it that keeps you hopeful?
Captain Beefheart.
That's an unusual answer. I'm not sure how to interpret it.
There was a great mentor of mine, was a guy called David Fleming, who there's an amazing book called Lean Logic, which I would recommend to people, who was a sort of a renegade economist and one of the loveliest people I ever knew. And when he was asked that question, what gives you hope, he would say Bach. But actually, my sensible answer to that question is Peter Kalmus, who's a climate scientist who I have a huge amount of respect for. When he's asked what keeps him hopeful, he says the fact that we have barely tried yet.
Oh, that's
it's like, don't come in here telling me that we can't do all this stuff, because we know what we've got to do, and we've hardly done any of it at all. Give us 20 years of doing all that stuff, and then come and tell me it doesn't work.
Wow. Thank you. That is a really inspiring and very galvanizing note to end on. Thank you so much. I know you've got to go for another call, but thank you so much for joining us today. It has been an absolute delight. I could have talked for many hours more.
We could. Good luck
you.
with the podcast, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to It's All Mental, a podcast from Everyturn Mental Health. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to follow, rate and share. See you next time.